Good afternoon. It's really exciting to be part of this meeting again this year and to bring lots of good colleagues that are conducting research across states and localities with help from their states funding as well as other sources of funding like federal dollars. To be able to share with you what we're learning as we work together to develop these important systems of early childhood. I'm not going to take a lot of time because I hope that you will be really interested in listening to some new data that we have from the National Survey of Early Care and Education, funded by ACF, Administration for Children and Families in Washington, and managed through OPRE. I have the luck to be the federal project officer for that study. And think of this presentation of trying to start the meeting, understanding a little bit, snapshots of data about who we're talking about. Who are the households that are looking for care? Who are the teachers and providers that work in programs? What are the characteristics of these programs? And how does the landscape of quality using some key indicators that you will recognize looks like across the country? I am going to let Shannon Rudisil, my colleague from ACF and director of the Office of Child Care, introduce the session. She is a tremendous, supporter of this project, and every time we talk to her about new data, she starts, getting excited and thinking about new questions to ask with the data. So I'm going to let her start, and then we're going to have a presentation by some key investigators in the project. Rupa Datta, who is a senior vice president at NORC, who is the main contractor. Bob Gerge, who is the principal investigator for the project at Chapin Hall. Marty Zaslow from SRCD and Child Trends, who is one of the main consultants in the study. So now I leave you with Shannon.
Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be here with you. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this project and try to put it in the context of folks who will be in the position of using this data, because that is me, and I think that will also hopefully be you. And so first thing I want to say is, although Evelise was very kind, I was a bit of a late convert in terms of understanding the importance of this project, because if any of you are out there, you're not the researcher, you're the one who uses it. You go to a lot of meetings with researchers where they tell you how many years it's going to be before you get the data, and they want to talk a long time about the methodology, and they want to tell you how much of the money you have tied up in this, but it's going to be 3 years before anything that you can actually use. Okay, so when the data started coming in, though, I was a total data convert on this study. I think we have a lot of data that we're going to be able to use. And I have to sympathize with Evelise and the team who had to come hear our impatience for all of those years, and especially Evelise, who had to explain to us why our child care research budget was tied up for so long. But I am confident now that we got way more than our money's worth out of this project. There are mountains and mountains of data that will, for the first time, describe the overall early care and education landscape in the United States. How many programs are there? What are families looking for? What are families using? So I think the team is going to talk to you a little bit about that. So a question I have is, how many people here, answer this honestly, consider themselves to be a data wonk? Raise your hands. See, like not that many, right? About maybe half. That's okay, because I'm not either. So our job during this session, though, is to be sure that you think about how we can use this data going forward. So I think my role here is to be the person who's already had a chance to look at some of this and describe for you some of how I'm making meaning out of it, because we have very smart people up here, all of whom are working on making meaning out of the data that we're seeing, but it's actually going to be a shared activity across the entire field to really decide whether ACF gets our money's worth out of this, whether or not people are really going to engage in trying to make some meaning out of the data that we're going to be showing you. And this is just going to be a little snapshot today. So I am going to try to serve in the role of reflecting on the data, some of the questions that it makes me think about, and hopefully that will help kind of whet your appetite and you'll be thinking about questions you want answered too. So I want to give you a a little teaser, though, to show you how I think that this could be powerful. So this isn't in this slide deck because we released it back in November, but I'm not sure it got quite as much play as I really wanted everyone to know about these findings. One of the things that we learned from some of the workforce findings that the team released in November had to do with how long the average early care and education teacher stays in the field. Not stays at their job, but stays in the field. And I could ask how long you'll think and have you shout it out, but I'll forego that for a minute. So and I'm going to try to do this from memory. The average early care and education teacher stays in the field about 10 years. And the average family child care provider is in the field at the time of being asked. So we don't even know how long they're staying. At the time they were asked, they'd been in 10 years. Family child care providers, 14 years at the time they were asked. So I think that that is longer than almost anybody that I have asked would have guessed. And if we think about what that means for us, we think about our professional development investments that we're making. Are we making professional development investments in a way that builds a workforce that we actually now acknowledge is staying with us for a very long time? As opposed to what I think has sometimes been our mental model, our conventional wisdom, that people are churning through really fast. We have to spend a lot of time on like orientation and beginner kinds of things. So if we know people are staying longer, we might be able to shift some resources from a lot of kind of beginner workshop things into thinking about how we develop a professional workforce that's going to stay with us, and maybe shift some of those professional development resources to compensation strategies over a period of time so we can, retain and reward people for that work they're doing. So that was probably Sue. That's just one example of how I think that some of this data could be useful to us over time. So we're going to start, I think, with household search patterns and what the team learned about families looking for early care and education. So I'm turning over to Rupa.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here, and hopefully we can infect you with some of the enthusiasm that Shannon infects us with every time we talk about these data. I realized I have not been trained in pointer. Okay. We're talking a lot about systems and support, and before Bob and Marty and I talk about this project, I want to acknowledge that doing this kind of study, data collection, design, actually requires a system and a team and a community all of its own. And we've been very lucky to have an incredibly talented community of researchers and data collectors and programmers and all sorts of other people. And we can't possibly acknowledge them all, but I do want to say what a pleasure it's been to work with lots of people. It also occurs to me that many of you in this room may have actually helped us in our data collection efforts and been the willing or unwilling, usually extremely helpful recipients of our requests as we were building the data, building sampling frames, all sorts of things. We relied very heavily on a lot of the state licensing lists, especially, and other work that the R&Rs are doing. And so I don't know, in my more than 20 years conducting nationally representative studies, whether I've ever been in a room with as many people who may have somehow participated in our data collection. It's kind of a unique experience for a researcher. So if you were out there, if this logo ever looks at all familiar, thank you very much, or thank your predecessors, because we did actually get participation from every single state and DC, although we were unable in the end to include the territories in our work. So I needed to say that. We are going to try to give you a smorgasbord today of what this study will yield for you and for us in the coming years. I'll talk very quickly about the overall NSCC study, what we were trying to do. I'm mostly going to talk to you about some of what we learned from parents about how they perceive early care and education and look for it for their own children. We'll tell you a little bit then from the provider side, the centers, the home-based providers, the people who are working in our classrooms. and what we know about those data. So the NSEC, as Shannon described, was designed to answer a large number of questions that I think you all, the federal government, people realized we needed better, harder data on to really make forward progress. And so our task was given as, we want to understand the experience of households, the experiences of people providing the care, how they interact. We need national estimates, but make sure you tell me what's relevant to each family individually. Don't tell me that things are happening in California and expect me to believe that that helps families in Virginia. And so we have done our best to execute a study that does all of those things. We will be talking mostly today about national estimates, but in the future, we, having done these individual descriptions of all of the component pieces, will be able to talk about how families and providers locally are interacting and what the challenges are that families in different places and providers in different places are experiencing. And that will be some of the future promise. So there are 4 key components to the NSEC, which we collected data in 2012. Households with children under the age of 13, home-based providers providing early care and education to children under 13, center-based programs providing early care and education to children not yet in kindergarten, and center-based classroom-assigned staff. I'm just going to spend a moment on a couple of these. Households, we canvassed more than 100,000 housing units in the country to find households that had children under 13 that could tell us about their experiences, both in terms of their need for childcare, their usage, and their perceptions, how much they spend on it, all sorts of things, whether or not they were using any kind of early care and education, whether or not they were paying for anything. I'm going to skip over home-based. Center-based programs, we're thinking about any kind of regular early care and education for children not yet in kindergarten, so birth through 5, basically, that's not in a home. So Head Start, for-profit daycare centers, schools that have pre-K programs or preschools. We sometimes, when we say center, don't think of an elementary school, but please do for our discussion. Faith-based centers, anything that's an organization. And for that purpose, we worked off of every list we could find, state lists, national lists, license-exempt lists, registered lists, any kind of list, accreditation lists, etc. Pre-K lists were a big one. Now, home-based providers, I'm going to go back to the middle bullet there. A home-based provider for our study and for life is somebody who is caring for children under the age of 13 in a residential setting, at least 5 hours a week, so regularly, and the child isn't their own. They're not the parent of the child. As you know, this is an incredibly broad, very diverse group. I'm not sure anyone would recognize them as a group. We're talking about, say, a resident grandmother who cares for kids after school. We may also be talking about a businessman or woman with a regular operation with many children, paid staff, the whole gamut. And so to find these people, we both looked within our households, all those 100,000 households we talked to. We looked for people who were caring for children. And we also looked in all of those lists we compiled. We identified home-based providers from that way as well. And so between those two, we should have covered the gamut of all of the different kinds of home-based providers. For shorthand, we talk about the top group as not appearing on state lists, and the bottom group as appearing on state lists. And that'll come up as we talk later. But we really are talking about a very diverse group. Okay, let's get to the good stuff. Households. We asked households, we were mostly talking to one of the parents, about their perceptions of early care and education. We asked them about 3 types of care, and right now I'm only talking about the children 0 to 5, not yet in kindergarten. We asked households about center-based care, family day care, and that should say relative or friend care. 25 people looked at these slides, and we still managed to let through a typo. So that's relative and friend care. And so what do we see? We see that parents favored relative or friend care. They had better perceptions of it than center-based care for everything but educational preparedness. So nurturing, relatives or friends were perceived as more nurturing than centers. Affordability, relatives or friends are seen as more affordable than centers. Flexibility, same thing. For educational preparedness, we see that centers are actually perceived to be slightly better. Now, what we did here was we asked parents to think about children the age of one of the children they had under age 13, but not their child. In general, for a child of that age, and in general, what is your perception of this type of care? Not the one down the street, not the one you use. What is your notion of how this type of care works? And so this lets us understand something about the overall perceptions that parents have, and eventually to separate that from what's actually available to them in their local community, in their price range, in their schedule, all of those kinds of things. So right now we're talking about parents abstracting to what can it be like. So we can look again about these same 4 characteristics: nurturingness, educational preparedness, affordability, and flexibility. And what we see is that center-based care actually is perceived better than infant and toddler care. So parents think that centers are better for preschoolers than they are for infants and toddlers. And they think that for all 4 of the measures. Okay? So even though centers weren't rated as highly as relative or friend care in general, they look better for preschoolers than for toddlers. However, you may have already noticed that centers still are not perceived as very affordable. Only 27% of parents thought that centers were affordable for infants and toddlers, and 40% for preschoolers. Now we're going to move to search. So we asked parents to think about an actual one of their children and the most recent time they searched for that child to get care. If that was within the last 24 months, we asked them a lot of details about that search. So now we really are talking about all of those constraints. What's available? What did you think you could afford? All of those things. How did your search work out? First question we asked is, well, why were you searching for care? In general, more parents were searching because they needed work support than for child development, to promote their child's education and social needs. However, what the bars show you is that for young children, infants and toddlers, more than half the time, parents were searching for care because of their own work needs. When you move to preschool-age children, 36 to 60 months, now more parents are looking for care because they are concerned with their child's emotional and social needs. Okay. One of the things we found as we were preparing to do this study is that parents often said that they only looked at one provider. They conducted a search, but they only looked one place. And that's a quite different model of search when you think about outreach, information, about quality of providers. They're only looking one place. You have to treat it differently. 2/3 of our households did search more than one place. 1/3, 37%, only considered one provider in their search. Of the 2/3, 63%, that considered more than one provider, 80% actually did consider a center-based provider. The shares that considered home-based, either people they knew, relatives or friends, or a home-based provider they didn't know, probably a family daycare provider, only a quarter had considered either of those. Who only searches one? Well, these could be mostly people who are thinking about grandma or the church or the one Head Start in their neighborhood, but it could also be you go to the R&R and they say, well, there's one place open right now that has openings and that will take your subsidy. My last slide, just in the nick of time, is that a lot of people are searching for care and not finding something that meets their needs. We found that 58% of searches did result in a new arrangement, but that means that 42% of the time households searched and decided not to change. That could be that parents continued to stay at home with their children. It could be that they continued to use their current arrangement.
So, all right, so this is a lot of data, as we said. So the idea here is that because I've seen the data already, I'm going to reflect a little bit what I thought when I saw the data, which is not to substitute for possibly other people who may even disagree, because I was a little unhappy we started with this one. I find it a little bit the hardest to make sense of compared to some of the other ones. So when I look at this data about parents' household search, first of all, I'm supposed to think about why it's relevant for all of you in your work and in my work, but I don't think that one's too hard, because we're in a parental choice environment in the early care and education field. So understanding how parents think about care is sort of fundamental to what we do. And a lot of you are probably investing money in parent outreach strategies and other kinds of public awareness campaigns, some of which cost quite a lot of money. So thinking about where parents are now in terms of their perceptions and the kinds of messages you're delivering, I think that one is not so hard to see why it would be relevant. What I was surprised by in this data is some of the perceptions were a little interesting to me. And I'm going to be frank about this and just think about this a little bit. If we could go back a little bit. You want to grab the clicker to the one where we look at family, childcare, and centers. So I think one of the things that surprised me was when you look at family, childcare, and centers, the perceptions of it. I think as professionals, we perceive big differences in flexibility and nurturing. We say, oh, parents see family childcare is much more nurturing, and we think it's much more flexible. I think we have to go back. All right, well, it's back a little ways, but this will whet your appetite to go and, oh, that one. Oh, now I lost it entirely, so I don't know what I'm doing. So that gap is not I don't think that gap was as wide for the parents as many of us as professionals perceive it either to be or that parents think it is. So what's going on there, I wonder? And I think there are a couple of things. First of all, I went and I pulled the usage patterns when somebody gets a child care subsidy, which is also surprising, and I have to always keep reminding people of this because people usually don't expect this. For families that receive a child care subsidy, for families with kids under 1 year of age, 64% of them are using a center, which I think most people find surprising. For the toddlers, 68% are using a center, and for preschoolers, less surprising, about 75% of the families with subsidy are using a center. So what that makes me think about is whether or not our public subsidy, like our public child care, this is only one hypothesis, is it enabling people to get closer to their preference? Because where they do see a big gap is on affordability. Affordability of centers is the big gap. So it makes me wonder if that's kind of bearing out a theory I've had for a while, that giving somebody a subsidy kind of frees them up to choose something that they might have perceived as less as out of reach before. But the other thing that I was thinking about, what does it mean for family childcare? Because I happen to be a huge family childcare advocate. I think, first of all, the family engagement that can happen in good family childcare is of just sort of a different type and quality than can sometimes happen in a center-based program. I think the flexibility is there, given some recent data that especially our union colleagues have been releasing about non-standard hours of people's work and that kind of thing. So the fact that parents who searched among a variety of providers, 80% of them looked at centers, less so family childcare, it makes me wonder if people are even aware, if people know about family childcare. So it makes me wonder in the QRIS context, if efforts to bring more family childcare into QRIS is going to impact that at all. If we'll have a better way of articulating some of the value of good family childcare to parents, will we see any differences? Will parents see that as a more viable choice, a more visible choice? Is family childcare sort of off the radar screen? And I think when we get to some different findings later, where we talk about the size of programs and the lack of programs in rural areas, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to think about, is it more viable to have certain children in family childcare homes, and what's the role of that sector and how we build it up? So those are the things that I've been thinking about, in relation to this. And I'll just say one other anecdote that sort of happened. We had a meeting the past 2 days. Many of our state child care administrators were here and are still here. We had a meeting to talk about child care subsidies as family supports and as child development supports. And we were privileged to have a very large multi-site provider with us, Mark Kehoe from Brightside Academies. And he said something really interesting. He said that he frequently asks his staff what families ask about when they come to visit. And he serves almost exclusively low-income children. And he said that families ask about convenience and they don't ask about education when they come to visit. And so I think we need to unpack that, because we talked about it a lot. Are we not reaching the families with the message? Or, and another state administrator and I were thinking about this later last night, is it that they feel that that's a luxury that they can't afford that's out of reach? As opposed to that they want the same things for their children that everybody wants, parents want that. Do they see that as something that's out of reach? So when we see data like this, to me, and this is why I was thinking that we started out with the hardest one, these kind of things, the household search, I think raises in some ways more questions. The researchers love to hear that. So, so I just made them really happy. So, I think it raises a lot of questions, but I also think that the study will, after we can do some more crosstabs, is the right term, we'll be able to unpack it a little more, because we'll find out what were these folks really using compared to perceptions. We'll be able to match their work schedules to what they were using. So I think this is one that I would flag as more to come later that will help clarify it. And then I think now we're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of the center-based programs in the study, and Bob is going to talk about that. And one thing I'll just remind everybody, because it's not necessarily intuitive, Rupa already said it. For the purposes of this study, a center is any center building, institutional building where children are in care, be it a school, a Head Start, a faith-based center, or in a church, so it's a very wide group of centers.
So I do think, thanks Shannon, I think it is important to say that although we've been spending most of our adult lives collecting this data, we also are going to spend the rest of our adult lives analyzing this data. So unpacking is really the key term. So we're really giving you an overview of this. I mean, each of these tables that we're talking about, we could probably spend an hour on just by themselves, not only trying to understand it, but also to identify more questions. So the first one we're going to look at is the percent of centers serving each child age. So when we look from left to right here, we see about a third, a little bit over a third of centers serving infants, which I would say surprised me a little bit, given talk about how much care, infant care is needed. As we get older, we see about the same percentage, a little bit more serving 1-year-olds, about half the centers serving 2-year-olds, and then what we would more expect is that most centers, 84 and 89%, serve 3 and 4-year-olds. And then we go back down when we're talking about kids who are 5-year-olds, not yet in kindergarten, and school-age children in kindergarten, about 40% of centers serving those aged children. This is a look at the size of centers. And we're look about half of centers serve fewer than 50 children. And about 20% serve fewer than 25 children. There are about a third of centers that are pretty big, serving 75 or more children. So while there's a pretty even distribution here, we do see somewhat more large centers, 75 or more. I guess here is the point where we're trying to unpack the diversity of centers. While Rupa described that we tried to capture every possible type of center we could think of, now we're at the part, we put them all together, now we're at the part we're trying to kind of unpack that and trying to see what types of centers there are there and trying to be able to communicate that in a way. So we're challenged to do that, and every time we present this data, we are perhaps do it a little bit better. About 70% of centers are open 30 or more hours weekly. Centers serving infants and toddlers are much more likely to be open longer hours. So these 6 bars represent groupings of age groups, 0 to 3-year-olds, 3 to 5-year-olds, and then school-age children. And if you look at the leftmost bar here, 42% of centers that serve 3 to 5-year-olds are open 30 hours or more. So again, looking at 3 to 5, just 3 to 5-year-olds are open 30 hours. So it's a small percentage. Whereas those centers that are serving infants, so the 2 big bars with the circles around them, are open longer, you would think, to serve those younger infants, those younger children. This looks at the auspice of these centers. Half are enrolled in non-for-profit centers. A little bit less than a third are for-profit centers. About 16% are in government centers, and government would include schools. Next question is, where do these centers get their revenue? So this is quite interesting given the issue of blended, combined funding that we all know about. 68% receive some tuition or fees from parents. Again, we're looking at all centers for all income groups. 70% receive at least some public funding, and then more than 40% of centers have 3 or more sources of revenues. So that really sheds light on this issue of combined funding and how providers really have to look to multiple sources of revenue in order to provide services. Now, just to focus on rural areas a little bit, which turns out to be quite different than urban and suburban areas. 50% of rural centers serve only children 3 to 5 years old, which is quite different than urban areas. And there's very little infant and toddler care in these rural areas. So we see much more infant and toddler care in urban areas. And centers serving young children provide less school-age care in rural areas, so less in that age group. Shan.
Okay, so a few slides, but a lot to talk about here for me. So the first thing, the reach of public dollars here is huge for me. That we had 70% getting some source of public dollars is really big. But it has a lot of implications in my mind, because one theory of action for us, I think, is, okay, one way you leverage quality is by putting strings on public money or putting standards on public money, So this gives us a really wide reach of those standards. If 70% of all people, and remember I run the subsidy program, which we all know is kind of messy compared to Head Start or pre-K, but one of the virtues of it is it's spread really wide. So if we can attach some quality standards to it, they go really wide, they go broad across a lot of settings. So that's the positive side about that. And I think that our theory is a little bit borne out by those workforce data that I mentioned earlier that we released in the fall. So one of the things we found there was that if a program was receiving public money, especially if it was Head Start or pre-K, guess what? Teachers had more education. Well, of course, because there's a standard there that says you need to have more education. So I think that we're seeing that theory play out as the data comes in, that public money does, through a couple of different mechanisms, lead to higher quality. But the other thing that's interesting here is that how many? 40% of programs get 3 or more sources of revenue, which means that if all these public sources had different standards or conflicting standards or confusing standards, that's that many programs that have to figure out how to make sense of all of that, right? Which I think just underscores the work that we've been doing at the federal level to try to bring the program standards more in alignment, the work that many of you are doing in your QRIS to try to use it as an alignment mechanism, which I think has been one of the later purposes of QRIS that's developed, because if folks are getting a variety of sources, that's great, but that means that they're going to have to make sense of a lot of different kinds of standards. And it also means that we already know this and we struggle with it, that they're going to need some technical assistance about how to pull that all together. The other thing that is really interesting to me is it has partially to do with financing. You could see the relative lack of infant toddler care compared to supply of care for older kids. That's a little worrisome to me, although I think until we get the demand side data, it would be premature to know how much to worry about it. But one of the things that I am worried about is, did you notice, you already know this, but it's nice to have data to back up what you already know, there's nobody pretty much providing care only to infants and toddlers. Everybody that's providing care to infants and toddlers has also got preschoolers or school agers, and we know why, right? Because you need to be able to finance it, and in order to finance it, you've got to have that range of ages. And so as we're thinking about ramping up pre-K through the Strong Start bill, which we're very excited about, or if your governor or your mayor is doing that, there's huge implications here for infant toddler supply and I'm glad that we have these findings so I can get on my favorite bully pulpit of the moment, is we need to get out in front of that infant toddler supply issue that's going to be barreling at us as we expand pre-K. No matter how you slice it, we're very committed to mixed delivery system. Secretary Duncan says it constantly, and he means it. I think even though that is a strong value, we're going to see more 4-year-olds in school. I mean, I think we all think that will be part of the trend. But it doesn't really, I don't think it's going to matter. I think that we have to think about infant toddler supply either way. Because either some of the 4-year-olds, more of the 4-year-olds will be moving into school-based settings, which means we have to worry about how we continue to finance viable infants and toddlers within community-based centers. Or a lot of the pre-K money will start flow to community-based centers, which will incentivize them to take care of more pre-K kids and infants and toddlers and convert more of their classrooms to pre-K. So no matter which way that plays out, we need to pay some real attention on the financing side to infant and toddler supply. So that's one of the things that I think comes out of here. The other one that I think we could look at that's a little bit surprising and maybe perplexing is you noticed how many programs are small. So we had, hold on, I wrote it down. 65% of the programs have 75 or fewer kids. Half have fewer than 50 kids. So we've been doing some work, and here I'm going to plug a session coming up later with APA, I think based here in Colorado, and Ann Mitchell on the provider cost of quality calculator. And they're going to have a session later, and we've tried to invest in the use of that as well at the Office of Child Care. One of the things that is starting to emerge is how hard it is to sustainably finance a small place. So we have sort of a quandary here when we look at this data. It's hard to finance a small place, but guess what? The vast majority of places are small. So what does that mean for us? I think that's something we've got to think seriously about, right? We're working on shared services, we're working on other things. It's probably going to take multiple strategies to figure out how we put that all together. So that's just a few of the things that emerged for me on these center-based findings. I think these are really interesting in terms of folks thinking about supply building, who's in the system, and how the funding streams are coming together. All right, so now we're going to talk about quality, and we have quite a lot to say about predictors of quality. So Marty Zazzle is going to cover that.
First, let me just say how good it is to be here with you, building together, and for my home base within this group, also inquiring together. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I also want to begin by thanking the leadership for this project, for the vision to do it, and for providing us all with a tool and a resource for understanding our current context better. As somebody who's worked on the predictors of quality within the data set, I want to acknowledge especially Rick Brandon and Bobby Weber. And Bobby's here, and if you could just, oh, Bobby, good up there. Thank you. And I'm going to share questions with Bobby, who is my teacher in so many of these matters. So the first thing I want to do is just talk for a moment about the structure of the presentation and why we're using the term predictors of quality. The National Survey of Early Care and Education could not go to all of the sites that we collected data at and observe quality directly. And observed quality, especially the nature of the interactions that young children experience, is the heart of quality. But we could, because we had surveys, we could ask a great deal, and we tried to anchor what we asked to the literature on what predicted to observed quality. And we also tried to go beyond a limited set. So we actually ask a fair number of things that we're calling predictors of quality that are characteristics of centers and home-based care that have been found in the literature to predict to quality, to observed quality. So that's just the terminology. The first bullet point just says that the core of quality is observed quality, and what we're talking about here are survey-based measures that we could ask that have been found to be associated. And what's important, especially within a QRIS setting, is that these are also features of care that we can set as goals, that we can articulate as standards. They can also be included in regulations. The last bullet here just says that some of the predictors of quality vary slightly in terms of the evidence-based in center-based care and home-based care, and also that sometimes the terminology has to differ slightly in center-based and home-based care. So we don't have exactly identical items in all cases. Now what I'm going to do is turn to centers and talk first about centers as programs, features of quality that pertain to the center as a whole, then to features of quality that pertain to the individuals working in them, so the teachers and caregivers working directly with the children, and then talk about classrooms and groups. And then I'm going to shift gears and talk about home-based providers. It's so wonderful to be in the presence of so many others who value this discussion. Home-based providers are just critical as well. So the first thing I want to talk about for centers now is continuity of care and those leaving centers. So we were able to estimate departure rate, which we defined as staff leaving in the prior 12 months as a share of those currently employed. It's a proxy for job turnover, but it's a very helpful statistic. And what we found is that high job turnover is concentrated in a minority of centers. 46%, almost half, had no departures in the past year. And only 1 in 4 had departure rates in excess of 20%. So this is a little bit like Shannon's observations of so many centers are small and so many caregivers have longevity. This is a corrective that we do have a problem with departures, but they seem to be concentrated. And an important question for the future is concentrated where, in what contexts? Now I'm going to talk about opportunities for professional development. Please again remember that we're talking about in centers. More than 2/3 of centers, the respondent at the center level, indicated that at the center level, they offered financial assistance for training or college courses. Then, in the data collected from the individual teachers and caregivers, they responded that almost half actually reported receiving assistance. We do not intend in juxtaposing those two figures to suggest that there's a problem, that there's financing out there that's going unused. Rather, it's entirely possible here that directors are making this available and teachers and caregivers can't go to a course at night, or that they're deploying the resources. And this is another finding that we're going to dig deeper into. Half of centers, 51%, reported offering on-site coaching or mentoring, and then the same pattern in terms of the receiving teachers and caregivers, 29.2% reported receiving, and the same thing here. We're not sure if the directors are deploying those resources to the classes that need it most, to certain age groups, or to deal with certain issues. I'm turning now to the issue of helping families with complementary services. So these are services like health screening or developmental assessments, therapeutic services such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, services for children with special needs, counseling for children or parents, social services. So I'm just going to present the total of centers that report making any of these available and then zero in on a couple of them. So a very high proportion, close to 89% of centers reported arranging complementary services for families. And developmental assessments were very high, with more than 80% of center leadership indicating that this was offered directly or arranged for by the center. And over a quarter, 26%, employed specialists for language development, special physical or emotional needs. This is another finding that we will want to contextualize. Was this in larger centers? Where were the centers that could actually employ specialists? Now I'm going to switch gears. Those are selected. We have many more markers of predictors of quality in centers. This is a selection of the findings. I'm going to switch now to talk about the individual teachers and caregivers. So more than half reported having post-secondary education in a major related to early care and education. 38% in early care and education specifically, and about 18% in a related field. So the distinction here, we defined early care and education major as child development, child care, and we considered it a relevant major if it was something like psychology, sociology, marriage and family therapy. And turning to the issue of certification, 46% of center teachers and caregivers reported that they had either a state certificate or a CDA. And there was an interesting difference in the pattern of these by poverty density of the community, where in high poverty density communities, over half reported having some form of certification, 25% or a quarter with a CDA, and in low poverty density communities, this was lower, 43% overall with a certificate of some kind, and about 16% with a CDA. So we wondered, this is something favorable in high poverty density communities. We wondered if this has to do with what types of care are available in these communities and public funding. In terms of types of professional developments, we distinguished between coursework that contributes to a degree and training outside of formal educational settings. This is workshops that did not contribute to a degree. They were outside of formal education. And most teachers and caregivers had reported that they had participated in workshops in the past 12 months, 84%. And of those attending, interestingly, almost half said that the workshop was part of a series rather than a freestanding, one-off kind of experience. So that was really interesting to us as well. But workshops seem to be very prevalent. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the attributes of the classrooms. The first set of findings pertains to group size. And just to orient you to the slide, you see the ages down the side of the table, and then the median for group size and the median for ratio. Those are the two figures I'm going to focus on. And what you see is a very nice stepwise increase in both group size and ratio. And these numbers are quite consistent with the findings in the early childhood longitudinal study birth cohort. Now I'm going to talk about the classrooms use of a curriculum by receipt of Head Start or pre-K funding. So the previous findings indicated that centers used different funding streams and some of them combined them. So this is just whether or not there was a use of a curriculum on the left by whether or not there was Head Start or public pre-K funding, then public pre-K but no Head Start, then both, and then neither. And what you can see is that public funding was associated with the use of a curriculum, and that it was especially high when Head Start was involved. Oh, this is really interesting, given program performance standards in Head Start. And now I'm going to shift gears entirely and talk about the attributes of home-based providers. And just begin with a little bit of context. These numbers are so strikingly different. The first group of 118,000 is listed providers, and these are the providers that appeared on the lists that have been discussed before. So it's any kind of, it's state and national lists of licensed, exempt, registered, et cetera. The second, much larger group is unlisted and paid. So these include family members, babysitters, and family daycare homes. And the very, very large third group is unlisted, unpaid providers. I'm going to set them aside and focus my attention on those who are listed and unlisted but paid. So the first set of findings is the complementary services that I talked about before, but here from the perspective of home-based providers. And what you can see is that there's going to be the beginnings of a pattern emerging here of differences across listed and unlisted paid providers. So for listed home-based providers, about 30% helped arrange a developmental assessment, and about half had access to family support, mental health services, or a guidance counselor. For paid unlisted providers, the percentages were 25.9% helping to arrange for developmental assessment, but only a quarter, substantially less, having access to family support, mental health service, or a guidance counselor. In the next slide, we're talking about education of the two groups of home-based providers. And the first bullet shows you the percent with less than a high school degree. And you can see that about a quarter of paid but unlisted providers had less than a high school degree, but only 5% of those listed. And this is part of a general pattern in which the listed providers tended to have higher education attainment. And here we're looking at workshop participation, and again, you can see a contrast across the two groups. The share that participated in a workshop was 3/4 for listed home-based providers and less than a quarter for unlisted home-based providers. And here, we're looking at whether the provider indicated that caring for children was a career or calling, helping with children involved helping parents, or allowed the provider to work at home and care for their own children. And what you can see here is that a much larger proportion, nearly half, of listed home-based providers reported that caring for children was a career or calling. And in contrast, the most prevalent response for unlisted paid home-based providers was helping parents. And now, the last data before we open it up is the use of a curriculum or planned activity. And again, we see a substantial contrast between listed providers, over half of whom reported using a curriculum or planned activity, and paid unlisted, which is just a little bit over 1/4. So now I'm eager to hear reactions from Shannon.
Okay, well, there's a lot here. And so I just want to say a little bit about some of the things that occurred to me. And I think we'll have time to hear from you, although I've been squinting to try to see if there are mics out there, and I don't see any. So the first thing that Marty alluded to is this does, I think, upend the conventional wisdom a little bit on turnover. In terms of, we tend to say we've got 25%, 30%, whatever it is, and we assume that that's across the board everywhere. But if in fact what we have is a small number of providers with extremely high turnover, that's a little bit of a different picture when it comes to things that I think would be very relevant to QRIS and quality improvement, like what's co-occurring there, which I think Marty mentioned, what's going on with the leadership there, what other kinds of characteristics, which I think we will be able to figure out at least some other characteristics of those programs, which I imagine y'all will now be very eager to find out what we find out about what else was going on in those programs, what was co-occurring. And I think we also sometimes have this very difficult conversation that we probably don't normally have with 600 or 700 people in a room, which is, okay, if there's a certain group of very troubled providers, and I know you talk about this behind closed doors, which ones do we need to lose through attrition? And if we lose them, what does that do to our supply? And which ones are really ready to make change, but due to financing or whatever reason haven't been able to yet, and are really reachable with our technical assistance and with helping them stabilize their program. So I think that this turnover finding really that one is sort of a flashing one for me, is trying to figure that out. The other thing that was really interesting to me about this is when we think about the professional development investments, and I didn't bring this with me because I just thought of it when I was sitting up here, but I frequently go back to this Government Accountability Office study. It was a survey of states. It's several years old now. It was about their professional development investments. And I think about 35, 37 states responded. They talked about what they've been spending their money on for a 3-year period. It came up with something like $1.4 billion spent on professional development, which is shockingly high to me. And it also, there's a pie chart in there, so you might want to look it up, about what it was spent on. It was a lot more workshops and community-based training than it was scholarships, and there was almost no compensation. Just a tiny little bit that a few states accounted for most of that. So I think that's also reflected somewhat here. As I was thinking of it today, looking at this data again, I saw parallels. Yeah, we got a lot of workshops. We have some scholarships. It seems less than the workshops. And when we put that together with the longevity data that I mentioned in the beginning, I think that just makes us want to think again about how are we spending the professional development money. And especially there was coaching going on in the investment data there, but that we had from the GAO, but not so much. So if we think that that's probably changed a good bit, because coaching has shifted, I think, over the past 3 years since those data were collected. But if we're thinking about what Marty and Deborah Phillips and some of the colleagues have been telling us, which is, and so now I'm talking about their wisdom, not mine, that it's training plus curriculum plus coaching, then we can start to look at this data about what people are getting and what they're using and seeing, you know, where have we got kind of the trifecta going on versus where we've got some training over here, some coaching over here. And the curriculum, I really want to be sure and point this out. First of all, I think ACF, we're totally delighted to see that the people who are most likely to be using a curriculum in the whole country is Head Start. We're really excited about that. But when you looked at that slide, Rupa pointed this out the other day, the bars there obscure where the kids are. So only 67% of the providers that weren't Head Start or Pre-K were using a curriculum, if you think back to that slide. But most kids are in that 67%, right? So, I mean, they're in the non-Head Start, non-Pre-K bucket. So we've got to think about, in terms of children's exposure to a curriculum, that's going to take another level of analysis. This was about programs' use of a curriculum. The other thing that's similar to that, in terms of just trying to puzzle out where the children are, we have quite a bit of data out of this study about high poverty density versus low poverty density. For most of us, it might not be surprising that we see actually some good programs in high poverty density neighborhoods, some higher teacher education in high poverty density, because that's what Head Start's doing, that's what pre-K investments that tend to be means tested, that's what's happening. Philanthropic investments are concentrated in those high poverty density communities. But I think, and Bob, tell me if I'm wrong, most poor children do not live in high poverty density communities. So that's another thing that we have to grapple with. That what do we do there? And I think that's something that y'all will want to think about as you're looking at your technical assistance, your professional development, how it's being arrayed out. The first instinct might be to go to the poorest neighborhoods. On the other hand, the poorest neighborhoods might already have more resources than some of the poor children who are now living in suburbs or other less high poverty communities. So I think that will be helpful in thinking through targeting. This was national data, and I think we said this, but it probably bears out. We don't have, for most states, almost no states had a big enough sample, maybe some of the super biggest ones, to get state representative data. So that's the other thing I think people are going to have to kind of turn over in your minds is, I think this is helpful, but you'll have to start thinking about your own states, your own community, your own data sources in terms of whether or not this holds true for you in your place. You know, and the last thing that I wanted to say about this one is when we think about the ancillary service, actually two more things. When we think about the ancillary services, the specialists, it looks like there's quite a bit of ancillary, you know, helping people do developmental screenings, referring to speech therapists and so forth. What we don't know from this at all is the intensity. I think we've actually masked, I mean, something about the way the question was asked probably has masked a huge difference in intensity of what people are really offering, because that kind of lumps together Head Start with the center that, you know, has some kind of book the R&R gave them on places you can refer people to, and it kind of lumps them all together. So I think that that one is a little tough one. But when you look at where specialists are, this slide didn't have it. We can cross-tab that with who had Head Start and pre-K funding. Probably most of those specialists are in places where we had Head Start or pre-K funding, which will also be important when you're thinking about specialists that you're trying to bring to the table through your QRIS or your family engagement. You've got mental health consultants, you've got behavioral specialists. Where do we target their time, right? We may have a sector that already has some resources to take care of that. We may have most of our poor kids actually not in those settings, so we may want to target those resources to the other settings where there are poor kids but that don't have that infrastructure built. Okay, truly last point on this. You notice I didn't talk much about the home base because it is very complicated. If you probably gathered that the home base data is very complicated. The one thing, though, that I think this may help us think about is with families working variable schedules, with all of these folks paid, unpaid, you know, available to do home-based services, some of which are not our licensed family child care. What's the role for those folks in our whole system? So I've been trying to think about how we create intentional packages of arrangements for families. So I want you to be, especially, you know, as your kid gets to 3, 4, attending a place where there's a strong curriculum, where we have a lot of, you know, high quality, more traditional preschool supports in place. That could be in a home, but someplace that has that. But if you're working nights and weekends, or you don't get your schedule till every, you know, 2 weeks before you're going to go to work, that's not going to meet your whole needs. You're also going to have a need to cover that time. So I think that looking at this data and thinking about your intake systems and how we could create an intentional package then that says, well, you're going to go to Head Start and then you're going to have a child care voucher that's going to help you get something more flexible for these other hours. One thing that we talked about in our subsidy meeting that happened the past 2 days is, and take this back, try to work on this, when a 4-year-old below poverty presents him or herself to your subsidy agency, how many check whether or not there's an available Head Start slot first before and sort of take care of that and then think about the wrap? Like, do we have an integrated intake that allows us to think at the same time about all the things we want for the kid, and also the parent's need for care, as well as the parent's great desire to have the school readiness piece too. So when we look at the home base, I think that's what it says to me, is there's some room, and I bet this is going to be a local, it seems to me like this is the kind of thing that is truly the work at the local level, is figuring out how we create more integrated kind of front-end systems to look at the whole family, look at the whole package of needs. Maybe we can link home visiting in that way for families that aren't working, so that we can put these things together better for families, so it's not happenstance of just which office they went to whether they were offered a slot and they had started the pre-K or they got a childcare subsidy, that we've actually kind of taken their needs all into account and tried to help them navigate that better. So that's some of what I was thinking in looking at this. It's such a great privilege to work with this team. As you can tell, there's a lot of food for thought.
Thank you, Shannon. I would thank Shannon for all those comments. And the presenters. Before we may have opportunity for a few questions if people are able to, yell them out in some way. But before we do that, I wanted to remind people of a couple of things. First, it is true this is a national survey. There will be some analysis done where we can look at different types of programs and how that may, go together with certain types of characteristics, etc. But a couple of things. All the survey instruments are available to you in the OPRE website. So if you're interested in replicating some of this in your own state and you're looking for instruments that have been already tested, I urge you to go to the website and look for those instruments for the households, center-based programs, home-based programs, as well as the workforce. The second thing is that there's 4 fact sheets that were loaded to the link related to this plenary that has some of the data we just presented. The full reports and briefs are in preparation and will be available very soon, and those contain many more analyses than what we were able to present in 1 hour here today, so I also urge you to do that. And for the analysts in the room, all the data from this project is going to be available publicly, so you're going to be able to do your own analysis. So the first set of public use files will be available this fall, and then restricted use files that will have information about geography and other things. If you qualify as a researcher to use those, you can also use those restricted data, and those will be available sometime in 2015. So now that I have said that, we can open up for a couple of questions to any of the presenters. So just, Jerry has a microphone. Please identify yourself and let us know if the question is for somebody in particular.
Hello? Oh, okay. Hi, I just had a question. I'm from Colorado, 619 coordinator, and we just had a question about, did the data that was presented include, in the pre-K, did that include children with disabilities? And was there any unique data collected on the preschoolers with disabilities?
So I think there were 2 questions. One was whether the pre-K data include pre-Ks that serve children with disabilities. Did I understand the question properly? And if so, yes. All pre-Ks serving children 0 to 5, not yet in kindergarten, are included. In terms of the information we have about whether or not children do have disabilities, we have data both from providers about the children they serve and from parents about their children. But I will say that we quickly determined that the right way to capture disabilities is maybe 30 questions, and we could afford 3. So we have some limited data, both from providers and parents, about their children's disabilities, but it's probably not as good and won't withstand as much unpacking as we might wish.
Hi, my name is Rosemarie Allen, Professor of Early Childhood Education here in Colorado. And I'm wondering, Bob, if you can help us understand how the majority of poor children do not live in high poverty areas.
How is it possible that the majority of poor children don't live in high poverty areas?
Well, even the high, so we have high poverty areas of those areas where more than 40% of the children live in poverty, and even in those communities, most children don't live in poverty. So even in our high poverty areas, most children don't live in poverty. And those areas in themselves are a small percentage of all census tracts or of communities in the country. So the poor children are really distributed in the moderate poverty areas, and even to a lesser extent, but even true in low poverty areas, we do have poor children also. So while there still is a group of areas where many poor children live, and there's a high concentration of poor children, even in those, I think it's important to say, even in those high poverty areas, we have less than half, in most cases, less than half of those children that live in those areas are living in poverty.
Is it It's working now. I'm Carol Burnett from Mississippi, and I had a question about the type of providers that were in the data. You said they were all types of providers that you were looking at, and I'm just wondering if you did any separation about providers that are reliant on the child care subsidy program versus providers that have Head Start funding, just because of the great differential in the amount of money that those providers have access to. And Shannon, you were talking about the wide reach of the subsidy program, but the amount that those providers get is so small. And I was curious because for the size of providers, for example, when you were talking about volume helping with financing, I'm curious as to whether those large providers might be more likely to be Head Start or public school rather than child care. So I was just curious if you had looked at it from that perspective to try to help understand ways that financing on the child care side might help support any efforts to ramp up quality expectations where the funding may not be available.
So that's, I referred to a little bit. We have many measures about these centers, many variables about them, and it's what we're trying to do on a regular basis is try to pull apart and create clusters of centers that look similar. So we've done some cluster analysis to look at how many different types of providers there are across the funding sources, auspice, size, age served, all those types of issues. So it is, we've also looked at, done work on how much free care is provided. So that starts getting at the subsidized question, and which includes Head Start and pre-K, but also there's a group of kids who get free care that aren't Head Start and pre-K. So that's, as I mentioned, that's kind of our challenge, is how do we describe these 129,000 center-based providers in a way that address the issues you mentioned and is recognizable to a group like this, that we can. Is it a group of 8? Is it a grouping of 4 different types? And that's still one of the challenges we have before us.
So I think that's a great question, Carol. And one of the things that we talked about a good bit at the beginning of the survey is how we would know if somebody was getting a child care subsidy, in this case meaning like a CCDF or a TANF type subsidy, because I'm not entirely sure that if you asked a parent, right, so we had to feel what kind of question could you ask that someone could answer. So I'm pretty sure we asked a provider if there was state government support. Is that right? I think that was the dimension.
The provider data on CCDF receipt are probably not bad. We'll find out. But we think those are not bad. For households, we know if they got help paying for care, and we know something about, did they recognize the name of the local R&R, do they work, would they lose their slot if they stopped working? But we don't for sure know if they're CCGF or not.
No, I just went. So the other thing you're making me think about, we do have more slides that we couldn't show today where we kind of cut it by state government, which I think at least on the provider side kind of gets to that. But I think you're absolutely right. And now we have a lot more things I could ask these guys to run. Like, does it tend to be the smaller places that get more state government? Does it tend to be the for-profit places or the non-profit? I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a lot more questions that we could be asking about that, and the data is here. It's just there's so much data that it's a matter of constantly they send us lists and say, okay, prioritize these. So I think there'll be some of that later.
Thank you very much.
So unfortunately, we had a lot more questions and not enough time, but I hope you're going to see this as just the beginning of the discussion this week. We want to keep kind of pushing the envelope, getting you thinking, sharing ideas, coming up with things we need to kind of all be moving on in different ways. So I just want to thank this wonderful panel for this great discussion and a great way to help launch the next 3 days of this meeting. Thank you.